Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, President Biden and GOP Congresswoman Liz Cheney both sharing warnings about a divided Republican Party, suggesting lawmakers are at odds over their support of former President Trump and election fraud claims. Florida Senator Rick Scott shares his thoughts on the state of his party, big tech, and the Biden administration's $2.3 trillion infrastructure plan. And Facebook's oversight board sparking a mix of reactions, ruling to uphold former President Trump's suspension, the move reigniting free speech debates, and calls for antitrust reforms. Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace discusses the board's ruling and how social media companies' influence could impact the future of politics. Plus commentary from Fox Nation host Tom Shillue. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Jerry Willis.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Shannon Bream, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, May 7th, 2021. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. Republicans slam President Biden's plans to tax and spend, but the president says the GOP doesn't even know what it stands for.
They're not talking about who's going to, be running the party. They're not talking about who's going to be the president in 24. They're talking about how do we improve this country and how do we stop the radical left Biden agenda.
We speak with Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott.
I'm Lisa Brady. Are they stopping violence or just stifling speech? The big tech debate heats up again as a Trump ban continues.
There's no question that that is mobilizing opposition on the right to these platforms and the argument that they're censoring conservative thought.
We speak with Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace.
And I'm Tom Shillue. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
While many Republicans are focused on limiting the amount of spending President Biden wants to do, the president is accusing Republicans of not having their act together.
It seems as though the Republican Party is trying to identify what it stands for. And they're in the midst of a significant sort of mini revolution going on in the Republican Party.
There is some infighting. House GOP Conference Chair, Wyoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney, may lose her position. She's facing a lot of criticism over her remarks about former President Trump, writing recently that the GOP's at a turning point, accusing many Republicans of following him with blind loyalty, not taking the Capitol riots seriously enough, and supporting the former president's claims about election fraud. South Carolina Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace was asked about the infighting on America's Newsroom.
The American experiment is all about a debate of ideas. We should be able to disagree and not be attacked over it. But in order for us to win back the House in 2 years, we must have a unified front, both our leadership and our conference as a whole. I sit in a swing district. I would like to keep that district and go out and get a few more so we can get a majority back so we can make changes for better prosperity, better freedom in this country right now. We've got to be unified, and that's my greatest frustration with all of it.
The former president himself weighed in on his own platform, urging Republican leadership to push Cheney out. So is the GOP going through a mini revolution, or is this normal post-election loss introspection?
Jessica, if you get outside of D.C., you don't hear any of this.
Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott.
And what they're focused on is jobs, better education, public safety. And what they're furious about is the Biden agenda. They want a secure border. They're frustrated with what he's done on the border. He's clearly created a crisis. They want their schools open. They don't want men playing in women's sports. They don't want to shut down the Keystone Pipeline. They don't want to shut down fossil fuels. They don't want to become energy independent. They're frustrated with all of Biden's proposals basically to radically change this country, which nobody voted for that. All these things they're doing. So, you get outside D.C., people in bed have any earthly idea what you would be talking about because they're so focused on their own personal lives and how to improve their families.
That said, this conversation about the GOP is happening as, article after article really gets printed about this division among Republicans, namely the idea that Congresswoman Liz Cheney might lose her position as conference chair in the House over her comments about President Trump and January 6th. My question for you is how big of a risk is it for Republicans ahead of 2022 to say that they're conservative but not necessarily a fan of President Trump's?
Jessica, I talk to people all day. all over, primarily in Florida, but all over the country. This is not even a conversation. They're thinking about their own families. They're saying, what can we do to get this economy going? What can we do to make sure we have options for our schools? What can we do to make sure we have a safe community? That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about who's gonna be running the party. They're not talking about who's going to be the president in 24. They're talking about how do we improve this country and how do we stop the radical left Biden agenda. That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about anything that's happening in D.C.
On that note, President Biden, when he talks about his plans to spend trillions of dollars with what he calls the American Jobs Act, the American Families Plan, when he talks about it, he says the spending is necessary in large part to compete with other countries, namely China, that, autocracies can just spend and decide, and they don't have to reach a consensus to do so. I assume you don't disagree with that reasoning, but you do disagree with that spending is the way to compete.
Look, I grew up with the American dream. The American dream is you start with nothing, like I did, living in public housing, not even knowing my dad, and you get to go build something. You don't build something through government doing things. You don't do something through government handouts. You do something because you come up with a great idea, and you figure out how to build a company. That's the dream of this country. It's not government spending. If you look at what Biden's doing right now, he's bankrupt in this country. We're at $28 trillion worth of debt. With the last bill they passed, which had very little to do with COVID, they called it a COVID bill. They'll take us to $30 trillion worth of debt. The next two bills, their so-called infrastructure bill, has like 6% for roads, bridges, airports, and seaports. They're spending basically very little more than what I spent on those things in my 8 years as governor for the whole country. So America doesn't want everything to be free because you know what they know? If government gives you something, one, they got to pay for it through somebody's taxes, and they're worried about it's going to be theirs. And number two, they know that if government gives you something, government sets all the rules. They take away all your freedom, all your liberty to do things. So when I travel, when I talk to people, they're not anxious for government to get bigger. They're anxious for government to get out of their lives so they can get their lives in order.
I know Republicans have introduced their own infrastructure bill. I think the price tag was close to $570 billion. What happens here now? Like, can some debate happen on the president's proposal and the Republican proposal? And is that debate happening now?
It's just it's clearly up to the Democrats. They didn't want to talk to us with regard to their so-called COVID bill that had little to do with COVID. So who knows what they're going to do? But what I'm going to make sure is whatever we do, it's going to be for roads, bridges, airports, and seaports, and it's going to be paid for. We cannot continue to run deficit after deficit after deficit. There's a day of reckoning for $30 trillion worth of debt. You can already look at inflation. Look at what's happened to gas prices since November. You can look at food prices. You can look at the price for household goods. So you can see what's going on. Inflation is happening. People are getting very concerned, and who inflation hurts the most is the poor and those on fixed income. Americans are very concerned about inflation. The Biden administration, and Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve wants to act like, nothing, spending to oblivion, borrowing money forever, and there's never any consequence. They think we'll never see inflation. So if history repeats itself, you cannot go waste money like this. And by the way, when Biden says he's only going to tax people making over $400,000 first, he's already passed a tax increase under the so-called COVID bill for Uber drivers, DoorDash, people like that. And the people who make over $400,000 a year don't make enough money to pay for all these programs that Biden wants to do. I mean, there's not enough money. He needs to be honest with the American public that he's trying to create a socialist society, which America does not want. We are a capitalist society. We want free markets. We want to make our own choices. We don't need government to run our lives.
I have a question about maybe something Republicans and Democrats might agree on. I earlier this week heard Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico at an Intel event. He was praising the company for investing billions to increase their manufacturing here in the U.S., and he said on the goal of manufacturing computer processing in the U.S., he has never seen such bipartisanship in Congress in his career. Is that your sense as well, that there are some issues that Republicans and the Democrats can agree on, maybe supply chain issues, manufacturing more here at home, especially if it comes to tech?
I think we all agree that Communist China has clearly decided to become our adversary. They want to dominate the world. They want to build a military bigger than ours. And we've got to do everything we can to buy American. Where we disagree on is where there's going to be through centralized planning. I completely oppose the federal government trying to decide how to run this country, how to run the manufacturing portion of our economy. The free market works. We all need to stop buying things made in China, start buying things made in America, but we don't need the federal government to run the policy. And by the way, when they do that, it always means bigger government, more money out of your pocket, your taxes. Every program they have, we have to all remember, it comes out of your pocket. You are going to pay higher taxes for everything they do.
Senator, speaking of free market, let's talk about big tech and social media companies, because you've introduced some legislation that would address data privacy and algorithms. But some of your colleagues are introducing legislation that, some could argue is not so free market. It has to do with breaking up big tech, antitrust. Talk to me about the importance in your mind of data privacy, how your proposed legislation differs, say, from California's data privacy law or Europe's GDPR. And secondly, do you support the legislation that some of your colleagues are introducing having to do with antitrust and big tech and social media?
Well, big tech acts like they can control everything. They want to censor conservatives, but they want to give brutal dictators like the Ayatollah and Maduro free pass. They want to gather, manipulate, and sell our personal data with no consequences. So I believe they have to be held accountable. We can all argue about how they should be held accountable, but in my case, I want to protect the rights of American citizens. I introduced the Data Act. It's going to give us, Americans, we're going to say what happens with our personal information, and there's going to be recourse if these big tech companies violate our privacy. We should be making decisions what you do with our data. We should be making decisions if you're going to go try to sell our personal information about our personal habits. You don't have a right to that. So that's where I want to hold big tech accountable. But when they go out and they act like they can control everything, they can censor some people, let other people talk, they are going to get held accountable. Americans are fed up with big tech taking their data with no consequences and censoring certain people and not others.
Are you supportive of maybe some of the other legislation, though, too, if something results in breaking up the companies?
Well, there's a lot of conversations about what we should do. What my biggest focus right now is making sure they can't control our own personal information. But the reason why we're having these conversations is that big tech is acting like a monopoly. And in this country, monopolies do get regulated. And so they're doing it to themselves.
I have one last question for you. Charlie Crist, former governor of Florida, says he will run for governor again against Ron DeSantis. My understanding, if I recall, he's a former Republican governor, but he's running as a Democrat now. I believe he lost to you in the governor's race in 2014. I'm wondering, based on some of the polling data we've been looking at, and I know polling data, but based on some of it, does he have a shot? It sounds like a new poll out this week has DeSantis just 5 points ahead of Crist.
Well, first off, Charlie's got to figure out what party he's in. That's number one. Number two is, as people understand what Charlie did in his 4 years, our home prices dropped in half, we lost 800,000 jobs, he raised taxes. As people go back and review his record, I think he'll have a very difficult time winning any race.
Senator Rick Scott, thank you so much for your time.
All right. Thanks, Jessica. Have a great day.
This is Tom Shillue with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
This week's ruling by the Facebook Oversight Board, upholding a ban on former President Donald Trump, but also calling the punishment arbitrary, is rekindling the debate over the power of social media companies, who they're silencing and what they're blocking.
The president's view is that the major platforms have a responsibility related to the health and safety of all Americans to stop amplifying untrustworthy content.
Especially, says White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki, disinformation and misinformation on vaccines and elections. But Republicans say there's a political bias. Louisiana Senator John Kennedy telling Fox News,
no one believes that these social media platforms will regulate or censor, let's say, Senator Bernie Sanders like they would former President Donald Trump.
Facebook says it believes the Trump ban was necessary and right after the Capitol riot. The Oversight Board says the company can't just make up penalties as it goes along, though, giving it a deadline to come up with a better plan.
Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook clearly wanted this semi-independent, I say semi-independent because they appointed them, board to settle this for them so they could say, well, it was the board that decided.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday.
And what the board ended up deciding was, look, you can keep the ban for 6 months. You basically don't have any rules. This seems to have been a completely ad hoc decision. So you've got 6 months to come up with your own policy, your own plan, and your own decision as to what you're going to do to Donald Trump. And, you know, they're not saying they're saying you can reinstate him, you can ban him, but you have to have a policy in place here. So basically, the Oversight Board took the hot potato and threw it right back to Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg and said, no, you handle it.
Of course, the former president didn't waste any time slamming not just Facebook, but Twitter and Google, which owns YouTube. The bottom line is, though, he's still not on those platforms. Do you think he can be as effective with the new platform that his former campaign manager created?
No, but this from the desk of, it's a website. You know, I mean, I had to laugh at their talk about, well, this is a new social media platform. It's a website. And a website is, incidentally, as you say, the website is banned by a lot of these other platforms. He was able to use the megaphone of Facebook and reach 100 million people and Facebook and, you know, and Twitter. And he doesn't have that right now. Now, maybe it'll change, but you know, this is not my area of strength, given that I'm not on either Twitter or Facebook. But I'm told by a lot of people who know more than I do that it would really be hard for him to successfully run for election in 2024, both in terms of getting his message out and also in terms of raising money without access to those platforms. So, you know, this is not just a question of his ability to talk and to use the megaphone. It may raise real practical questions about his ability to run for president, and that raises questions, of course, about can or should a media platform like Facebook be able to, in effect, as a practical matter, block somebody from running for election.
Well, and then it gets into this larger debate, too, that conservatives are trying to say that they're being targeted by these platforms. And it's a debate that's overlapping with Republican leadership struggles now, too. Congressman Liz Cheney was staring down a second no-confidence vote with Congrwoman Elise Stefanik building support to replace her. Well, then Twitter suspended the account of Stefanik's communications chief. Do these companies think that people want them to draw red lines like election fraud is a blacklisted topic, or are they digging a hole for themselves?
Well, you know, I think it's both are true, that they do want the clearly, and particularly, you know, we do have to say January 6th happened, the insurrection at the Capitol happened. This isn't just simply an intellectual exercise on the part of these social media platforms. They have every reason to believe that the big lie, and that's what it was, that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, that the spreading of that message on their platforms contributed to the insurrection at the Capitol and the violence at the Capitol. So I can understand, on the one hand, their concern about not wanting to give cover to, you know, one of the things they do say is they don't want to propagate any speech which incites violence. On the other hand, that there's no question that is mobilizing opposition on the right to these platforms and the argument that they're censoring conservative thought.
Congresswoman Cheney wrote an op-ed urging Republicans, as she put it, to stand for genuinely conservative principles and steer away from the, quote, dangerous and anti-democratic Trump cult of personality. Is that the crux of what's facing the Republican Party?
Well, no, I don't think so. And I think you have to look at these weeks since January 6th and what Liz Cheney has said and done in context as a narrative to understand what the objection of Republicans. Remember when she first came out and voted for impeachment and first took on Donald Trump, there was a test vote as to whether to oust her in the Republican caucus in the House, and she won overwhelmingly, almost 3-1. But because at that point people weren't willing to say, hey, if you oppose Donald Trump, you can't be a leader in the party. I think the issue is more that she has continued to talk about that as opposed to other people who voted for impeachment who just stopped talking about it. They made their point and they moved on to pursue a lot of other issues. And I think it's fair to say that Liz Cheney, and I'm not saying that she's right or wrong to do this, but she continued to pick the scab off the open wound of Donald Trump and what he did about the election on January 6th. And if you're a Republican member of Congress and you want to take back the House in 2022 and you want to have Kevin McCarthy as the speaker, when you've got a majority of Republicans saying they still support Donald Trump, and I think a majority still believe that the election was stolen, is that a fight you want to pick? So I can understand a Republican who maybe doesn't even have that much sympathy or support for Donald Trump saying, I don't want the number 3 leader in the House to be constantly making this argument and constantly alienate not just Donald Trump, forget about him, but the millions of people who support Donald Trump. It isn't a formula for success in the 2022 midterms.
President Biden continues to make the case that his spending proposals are necessary, they're worth it in the grand scheme of things. Is that gaining any traction with the American public?
Well, it's apparently pretty popular. The more interesting subject to me, Lisa, is that he made a couple of statements this week that he really is interested in a bipartisan compromise. I'm not sure whether that's true or not. But, the rubber's going to hit the road here. This next week, he's going to be meeting with McConnell and McCarthy and Pelosi and Schumer, the 4 congressional leaders, for the first time since he became president. And, there is a compromise to be made at a smaller number, a considerably smaller number. He wants $2.3 trillion. I think Republicans would probably go for $700 or $800 billion, which is an enormous amount of money. But in Washington terms today, it's pocket change. And if he were willing to settle for that, and frankly, you get all the hardcore infrastructure for that. You don't get the $400 billion for elderly care or disabled care, but you do get roads, bridges, highways, airports, water services, broadband. If he were willing to settle for that, my guess is you could get a deal made. I think it's awfully interesting to see whether or not he's willing to do that. I think there are very strong arguments for, you don't get everything you ask for, but it's good for the country to get something with bipartisan buy-in to show that Republicans and Democrats can legislate, can agree, can pass something. And, $800 billion in infrastructure is a whole lot of money.
He and other national leaders are being accused yet again of some mixed messaging on masks because of what they're doing or not doing, and maybe, sending the wrong message. Like they're talking about if you're fully vaccinated, you can do more, you don't need a mask outside. But then he still wears one most of the time. Is that a problem? Is that making it harder for the country to kind of get on with things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it, because, I know my first reaction, I'm fully vaccinated, and I raced to get vaccinated. I signed up, like I think a lot of people did, with a half a dozen websites to try to get vaccinated, and got as quickly as I could. My wife has as well. And, my first reaction was a tremendous sense of relief. This is the get-out-of-jail-free card. And then you found, well, you really can't change your life. You still have to wear a mask, and you still have to socially distance, and there are questions as to how close you can get to your grandkids. It seems to me one of the strongest incentives to get people, and the biggest issue right now, it seems to me, isn't the mixed messages over masking. It's the reluctance of people to get the vaccine. We were up at 4 million people a day. Now we're down to 1 million a day, and we're not going to get, the kind of widespread immunity at 1 million a day. So it seems to me, to the degree that you say to people, and not just an official on the camera on TV, but people looking in their daily lives, that you say, if you get vaccinated, you get to do things that you safely that you couldn't do before. To me, that's the best message there is out there, that, well, get vaccinated, because the sooner you're vaccinated, the sooner you get back to normal. And to the degree that we're saying you get vaccinated, but then you still can't be back to normal, that's a disincentive to get the shot.
Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday.
Can I just quickly say who we got this week?
Yes, please do.
I'm very excited. One of the co-chairs of the Facebook Oversight Board, former federal judge Michael McConnell, and we're going to talk to him about the decision they made and the issues of free speech and political censorship, all of that. And then we're going to be talking to Jim Banks, the head of the Republican Study Committee. He's one of the top Republicans, and he was one of the people pushing for the ouster of Liz Cheney. So both of those stories on Fox News Sunday.
Oh, I can't wait. 2 p.m. on Fox News Channel. Do not miss it. Chris Wallace, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. My pleasure.
Hey, it's Brett Larson, inviting you to download and listen to the new daily Fox on Tech podcast. There's part of a colorful late 90s iMac on Mars. It's an idea that seems a lot like Kickstarter called Build It. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
A Florida sheriff's office has received a donation for its Fallen Officers Fund from an unlikely source. Deputy Kevin Baker is with the Hillsborough County, Florida Sheriff's Office, and in mid-February, he pulled over a driver for going 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. But instead of giving the person behind the wheel a ticket, he let her off with a warning. In April, Deputy Baker got a thank you card from the driver with a check for $253, the same amount the ticket would have been. The driver said she was sending the money as a donation for Memorial Fund for fallen officer Michael Magley, who died in February while trying to stop a suspected drunk driver. In a Facebook post, the Hillsborough Sheriff's Department thanked the driver for the donation with the message, quote, "A hero remembered never dies." Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Tom Shillue.
What's on your mind?
Hey, Mom. It's me, Tom. Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. Look, I know I could give you a call, but isn't this kind of cool? Using the Fox News rundown to say Happy Mother's Day? Come on, tell me, who among your children or your grandchildren can say they wished you Happy Mother's Day via a podcast? Huh? Okay, all right, I'll admit it. I forgot to send a card. So, if I'm the only one of your kids who forgot to send a card, maybe this'll make up for it? Maybe? While I'm at it, there's a lot of other mothers out there listening, so happy Mother's Day to all of you. And Mom, don't worry, I will give you a call too. Okay, my work is done. Wait a minute. My wife is a mom too. If I forget her card, she won't be as kind as Mom, and she won't fall for the podcast routine either. All right, I gotta go buy some flowers.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. New from the Fox News Podcasts Network.
My name is Kennedy, and welcome to my podcast, which will, I humbly say, single-handedly save the world. You're welcome.
It's Kennedy Saves the World. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.